Amateur Traveler is in its 20th year now, but can you imagine if I had people on the show who had never been to the destination, but had just read about it or seen a movie about it? That wouldn't make any sense at all, and you wouldn't listen. We all know how important it is to receive advice from people who know a destination to get the most authentic local experience. And a great option for experiencing this is Explore Worldwide and their authentic small group adventures, led by local tour leaders, perfect for solo travelers who want to meet like minded people with a desire for adventure. I'm often an independent traveler, but two of my last three trips were with small group tours because they organize everything and it's a lot easier. If you want to recreate the tour I did to Malta, they have a Malta and Gozo Discovery Tour. I'm intrigued by one of their tours called A Taste of Sicily. The company again is Explore Worldwide, and visit exploreworldwide.com to learn more. And thanks to Explore Worldwide for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler. The nights are long, the days are short, and the weather is chilly to downright cold, depending on where you are. It's a good time to slip into a Quince iconic Mongolian cashmere sweaters, which start at only $50. You can treat yourself to everyday luxury at an affordable price with Quince. If you really want to dive into luxury, you can check out their leather handbags, washable silk shirts, and European linen sheet sets. Whatever you're looking for at Quince, all the prices are 50 to 80% less than similar brands, and they do that by partnering directly with top factories and cutting out the middleman. They only work with factories that use safe, ethical, and responsible manufacturing processes. And of course, they use premium fabrics and finishes for that luxury feel in every piece. But you've already heard me rave about my Quince travel pants. Treat yourself this winter without the luxury price tag. Go to quince.com/traveler for 365-day returns plus free shipping on your order. That's QUINCE.com/traveler to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/traveler. And thanks to Quince for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler. Amateur Traveler, Episode 111. Today the Amateur Traveler goes to Mongolia. Learn the many uses of yak's milk, the real name for Genghis Khan, and where you can stop on the way to play with baby pandas.
I got my bags packed and on a roll. I'm heading out there and I'm ready to go. I'm looking real good in my passport photo. Oh no, 15-hour flight. Oh, I don't think I'll ever be coming home. You know I love it. I got to see one more cathedral. I got to sit in one more cafe. I know that I should be heading home, but maybe not today.
Welcome to the Amateur Traveler. I'm your host, Chris Christensen. I have two news stories for you today. The first one is a report that's come out called Buckle Your Seatbelts, Airline Executives Predict More Fees and Plan to Sell More Services via their websites. Basically, this report has surveyed airlines around the world and found a number of places where airlines are unbundling fees, that is, charging separate for them. Those of you in the United States are familiar with that in terms of onboard meals not being included anymore. And they have a report on who's charging for what. Around the world, 52% of airlines are charging for making a booking via the call center. 39% are charging for onboard meals or sandwiches. 29% are charging for pre-assigned premium seats or exit rows. 26% are charging for an online light snack such as pretzels. 26% are charging for onboard beverages such as cola or juice. 20% are charging for online payment with a credit card. 19% are charging for videos, movies, or live television. 13% for pre-assigned seats. 8% for checking that first piece of baggage. And 5% for making a booking on the website. An interesting report to read. I'll put a link to that in the show notes at amateurtraveler.com. The second story we have is that today, which for me is October 25th, the world's largest airliner entered commercial service. And that was the first of the Airbus A380s, which began its first flight from Singapore to Sydney, Australia. According to the reports I read, the airplane carried 455 passengers. or you might think of this as bad news, depending on how many of those 455 passengers are crying babies. Check out links to both of those on the show notes at amateurtraveler.com. I'd like to welcome back to the show Chris Willis, who has come on before providing two of our most interesting shows, really, which is going to Tonga and swimming with whales, and then going to Rwanda and seeing the mountain gorillas. And Chris has come back to talk about a recent trip to Mongolia. Chris, welcome back to the show.
Thanks a lot, Chris. I always appreciate the opportunity to be on your show and talk to your listeners.
And I understand your wife is accusing you now of planning your trips to get you back on the show. Is that my understanding?
Yes. I mean, we try to think of the most outrageous destination possible with the hopes of attracting your interest in interviewing me again, and this time it seems to have worked again.
So it was Cleveland or Mongolia, and you decided that Mongolia was going to get you back on the show.
Well, I just figured it would catch your attention.
It did indeed. So other than that, why go to Mongolia?
Well, the thing about Mongolia is it's a less visited destination, which always appeals to us. It's a place that has an incredibly rich history going back to the time of Genghis Khan, when Mongolians really ruled much of the known world, and even going forward to their interactions with China and then later with the Soviet Union. So it's got a lot of history to discover there. It has a unique culture that's very different from that of other Asian countries, being a primarily traditionally nomadic culture instead of living in fixed places. And the other thing about Mongolia is it has these huge expanses of unspoiled natural landscapes, like the Gobi Desert, for example, or the steppes in central Mongolia, that are perfect for outdoor kind of activities. And it's got some unique wildlife to boot. So all of those things kind of combine to make us interested in going there.
And what sort of things stand out from the trip?
I would say that just an overall exposure to the people and the culture of the country will always stay with us. Probably my fondest memory of the trip occurred in a national park in central Mongolia called Hustai National Park. It's a park that's notable primarily for the fact that there's a breed of wild horses that lived there, went extinct in the wild, and then was reintroduced in 1990 or so from zoo populations. And now they have about 250 of these horses living in this park. And in the afternoons and mornings, you can go into the park and look for these wild horses that have never been domesticated. That's their distinction. They're the only horses in the world that have never been domesticated. And we had a great encounter with a small group of those horses, about 12 of them, where we encountered them in this very mountainous area up at the top of a ridge in perfect late afternoon sunlight, great for photography. Got really close to them, probably 40 or 50 feet, and just had an opportunity to watch them graze. There were two foals in the group that were nursing, and there was no human in sight. Besides the two of us, it was just us and the horses on this quiet, very scenic, lush, grass-covered mountaintop. And seeing such a rare animal, there's probably only 300 of them in the world, seeing them up close and seeing them without the distraction of other people around was probably the most special memory I'll carry with me from the trip.
For those of you who haven't heard Chris on the show before, he is a photographer, and we will be posting up a link on the show notes at amateurtraveler.com to his pictures. So if you're not looking at the iTunes enhanced version, you will want to check these out. Trust me, because I'm looking at them right now. Now, you said just the two of you. So were you on a tour of Mongolia, or did you do this on your own? How does one go to Mongolia?
Well, I think it's possible to travel independently in Mongolia, and I've read about a lot of people who do so. We're not brave enough typically to do that, so we did have an organized tour with a guide who stayed with us for the entire 10 days we were in Mongolia, even taking the flights with us to various parts of the country. We booked it through a company that's based here in the United States in California that specializes in Mongolia. But what had happened was we were out of sight of our guide and driver when we encountered the horses because we had to walk some distance from where we had parked the van, and they stayed with the van and just sent us off to where the horses were.
And what company did you use to book the tour?
It's a company in California called Mongol Global Tour Company.
Okay. And would you recommend them?
Yes.
Okay.
We actually heard about them from another friend of ours who we met online who took a trip nearly identical to ours 2 years ago, and she had planned her trip through them. And so based on her experience, we felt confident in choosing them. And the whole trip went off very well, and our guide was excellent, so I wouldn't have any trouble recommending them.
How large an area were you trying to cover with your itinerary?
Whenever you do a tour of Mongolia, pretty much everybody has to use the capital city as the jumping off point because that's a place where you can then fly or drive to other parts of the country. So we basically were visiting about 4 areas of the country. The capital city, the Gobi Desert, which is in the southern part of Mongolia. There's a lake called Lake Hufskel that's on the northern side of Mongolia on the border with Siberia. It's a beautiful freshwater lake. And then we also went out to the west to Karakoram, which was the ancient capital of Chinggis Khan. And on the way back in, we hit Hustai National Park, which is where the wild horses live. Now, there's a lot of Mongolia that we didn't explore. There's a huge chain of mountains out in the west that go out of Mongolia and into Kazakhstan called the Altai Mountains. That's a popular destination for some tourists. And then there's also some interesting areas to the east of Mongolia that we didn't visit at all just because of lack of time.
Now, I'm going to ask, because I've heard you say it now twice and I didn't catch you the first time. You're saying Chinggis Khan, and I have grown up saying Genghis Khan. Are we just mispronouncing it?
Yes, Genghis, which is the way that most Americans would pronounce it, is actually a French corruption of the original pronunciation of the word. And the way that Mongolians pronounce it is Chinggis, and they spell it Chinggis. And in fact, you see it written that way all over the place. Chinggis Khan is an important historical figure that gets a lot of play in Mongolia, and so you get a chance to hear his name pronounced by Mongolians all the time, and I assume they're using the correct pronunciation rather than the French one.
And since he was leading a nomadic lifestyle, there's Chinggis Khan slept here everywhere. Is that the...
Well, I mean, yes. I think that there was some nomadic lifestyle, but there was actually a capital that he established, which is a place that can be visited by tourists now, although there's not much left of the ancient capital anymore. It was destroyed by the Chinese when they invaded Mongolia about 100 years later.
Okay. I guess one of the questions I had for you is, if I go to describe the most remote locations, Mongolia is one of those place names that's going to come up because that's part of the perception. Does it feel like you're that far away when you're there?
It definitely does, because Mongolia has the honor of being the least densely populated country on the face of the earth. It's a giant country that covers a huge expanse of land, has a population of only roughly 7 million people, of whom probably 40% live in the vicinity of the capital city. So the remainder are stretched out extremely sparsely over the rest of the landscape. And the experience of being in any area outside a major city is one of just being in gigantic expanses of wide open, completely undeveloped land with little or no trace of human habitation. So you can be driving along through the Gobi Desert, for example, and it's just this huge flat expanse of grassland with some mountains in the distance, and you might see 1 or 2 tents called gurs every once in a while, maybe a little herd of goats or sheep or camels or something, and that's really the only sign of human habitation you see. So when you're out there, it does feel like you're in a very remote, undeveloped, unpopulated place, far removed from what we would know as big city civilization.
Now, that was one thing that surprised me from your pictures is you say Gobi Desert, I think sand dunes, and you had some pictures of sand dunes, but a lot of it is what looks like shortgrass prairie.
Right, and it was actually very surprising to us. We were flying into it, we saw this green on the ground, and we were shocked. Gobi Desert isn't a desert made primarily of sand, as you would expect. You know, for example, if you've been to Egypt or you've seen the Sahara Desert or the Kalahari Desert in southern Africa, which are very sandy deserts, the Gobi is a desert by definition because it receives very little rainfall every year. So, for example, there are little or no trees in the Gobi Desert. There's not enough rainfall to support any trees, but the rain is sufficient to produce grass sometimes, and we were told that this summer, the summer of 2007, they had exceptionally heavy rains, and so the desert was far greener than normal. I've been told by other travelers who visited the Gobi at other times in other years that it wasn't sand when they visited, it was just a lot of brown kind of dirt and gravel. Wasn't as nice to the eye as we had it, but still wasn't sand dunes. There are only a couple of places in the Gobi Desert where they have sand dunes, and you can go and visit them, but that's not what the whole thing is like. It's much more gravelly and grassy.
Did you pick the time that you traveled there to coincide with what little rainy season there were, or how did you decide when to go to Mongolia?
We decided based primarily on weather, because you can't really go to Mongolia past September because it gets too cold.
Okay.
And you can't really go before probably May or June because it's too cold. Mongolia is pretty far north, and it's all at significant elevation, 4,000 or 5,000 feet, so it gets really cold in the winter. So we had to pick from the window between, say, June and mid-September, and in doing so, we just looked and found that September seemed to be the one of those months that had the least rainfall, and we wanted to have sunny skies for photography and just for our general enjoyment of the trip. So although there are warmer months like June and July, I think they also tend to be rainier. So we picked the month that we thought would have the best weather. We got lucky in that it coincided with a time that there were very few other tourists there because July is the peak of Mongolia's tourist season.
And how busy is it, do you know, in the peak of the tourist season?
By comparison to other heavily visited destinations, not busy at all. The thing that draws tourists in July is they have an annual festival called the Nadam Festival, where they participate in traditional games like archery and wrestling and horse racing.
Okay.
And all of that happens in the capital city, and so all the tourists are there to see that festival, and so they're all congregated kind of in one spot, and that probably makes it feel a little crowded. Plus, there's a lot of Mongolians there. They come in from all over the country to either participate in or witness the games.
Interesting. Okay.
So that probably does feel a little crowded if you're in the capital city during Nadam.
In terms of it being a large country, you were getting around mostly by air, I think you said before we started recording?
In the amount of time we had, which was 10 days, that's the only practical way to cover distance in Mongolia. It is possible to travel by road, and independent travelers will frequently do so in order to get a real taste of what Mongolian life is like. Unfortunately, the road network there is not particularly well maintained, and so it can take a really long time to get from one place to the other because the roads are poor and the distances involved are very great. You can encounter delays because it's rained hard and the rain's washed out a road, or the bus you're on breaks down, or things like that, and we just didn't have time. So there are 2 domestic airlines within Mongolia that have daily flights to the various places tourists would want to go, and we got around that way without incident.
Okay. And then you'd pick up a rental car, basically, with your driver?
Well, actually, the driver would be someone local.
Okay.
Our guide would be with us. And it wasn't generally a rental car. It would be a driver who worked for a tour company locally. Or, like, for example, when we went to Lake Hufskull, the driver that came and got us was the driver from the camp where we stayed by the side of the lake. He drove down to the airport and got us and our guide and drove us up there.
And speaking of Lake Hufskull, am I saying it correctly?
Hufskull.
Hufskull.
Yes.
I was a little surprised seeing some of the pictures that you have from that. Portions of it look like they could be the Sierra or the Rocky Mountains. Tall pine trees or whatever is not my picture, again, my mental image of when you say Mongolia. I don't get this image.
Well, it's very different from an ecological standpoint from most of the rest of Mongolia. It's located way in the northern part of the country, right across from Siberia and right over the border from Lake Baikal in Russia, if you're familiar with that. And the ecosystem in that area is an evergreen forest ecosystem that's characterized by relatively heavy rainfall and very lush, heavily forested mountains. That rainfall is responsible for both the Lake Hufskull that we visited and Lake Baikal, which is just 100 miles or so to the north. So it's unusual in Mongolia in the sense that it does get a lot of precipitation and is very lush. And I can tell you from being there in person, it's one of the most incredibly spectacular, scenic places I've ever seen.
And, of course, I'm not used to seeing yaks when I'm in the Sierras or in the Rocky Mountains, so obviously the animals that you were seeing are a little different from what I'm used to.
The domesticated animals, they do have a lot of yaks there because it's in the northern part of Mongolia, and yaks have a thicker coat, of course, than traditional domestic cattle, and they're better able to survive the extremely harsh winters that they have up in that part of Mongolia because Lake Hufskull, in addition to being almost in Siberia because it's so far north, is also at significant elevation, 5,500 feet or so. And so it gets very, very cold there in the winter, and so yaks are really much more suited to surviving that than cattle.
One of the pictures that you have, as I think a little bit about food here, is you have a picture of yak dairy products, yak milk cream and yak cookies made from yak milk yogurt. So the yak is a main portion, I would gather, of the food that the locals are eating in that area.
Yes, and given the fact that traditionally Mongolians are nomadic, herding people, they're used to making maximum use of different kinds of domesticated animals for all their needs. So, for example, they drink horse milk also and have products that are made out of horse milk. They have camels, goats, sheep, yaks, and cattle. Those are generally the five animals that they keep as domestic animals, and they have a variety of ways that they use those animals for food, for clothing, and for shelter. They're not wasteful about it because it's difficult to raise animals in that environment, and they have to make maximum use of whatever they have.
And did you find the food to be interesting, very tasty, sustenance?
I'd put it in the category of sustenance because Mongolian food traditionally is not very tasty because, again, thinking back to their traditions, they're not farmers, so what they have access to is animal meat, and so it's a diet that's heavy on meat from various animals, whether it's cattle, yak, sheep, or whatever, and then maybe with a little bit of potatoes or rice or something else like that thrown in, but spiciness and flavor and variety I don't think is a big emphasis in that cuisine because really it's more about survival than spending time coming out with the tastiest dish.
Interesting. And was there a moment that really stands out on your trip with, I'm really far from home?
Probably the first night that we spent in the Gobi Desert, which was the first place that we went outside of the capital. We were out there, we were staying in a gur camp, and we were the only tourists there, only guests there. You could walk outside at night, and the sky was so full of stars, you couldn't even make out constellations because so many stars were visible. It was quiet. There was just a little bit of a breeze blowing. We were out in the middle of nowhere with no human activity visible or audible, and definitely that will put you in the mindset of being in a remote place far from home.
Interesting. Tell us a little bit about the people. Now, there was a language barrier, I gathered, between most of the locals.
Yes, definitely. There's not a lot of people who speak English there. The people tend to be courteous without being overwhelmingly outgoing. They're relatively quiet, at least in our experience, courteous and nice and not hostile in any way. You don't have aggressive begging or aggressive merchants trying to sell you things as you do in some other popular tourist destinations. It tends to be people who seem to be pretty much going about their business and minding their own affairs.
You have several pictures of monuments, roadside monuments to local spirits.
Yeah, that's a big thing over there. They have a lot of those. It's basically just a pile of rocks with some pieces of wood sticking out of it, and then they have these kind of scarves or blue pieces of fabric that are wrapped around various parts of the monument. And you probably can't see this from the pictures, but people will come and leave offerings of money or other items in the rocks. So, there'll be like a little piece of currency stuck in between a couple of the rocks, or there'll be a bottle of liquor there or something like that. And these monuments, these stone piles, are said to be the homes of local spirits that you have to pay homage to as you pass. So we'd get out at one, and my wife and I would be busy taking pictures of it, and our guide and our driver would walk around it 3 times because that's what you have to do to pay homage to the spirits. And people who were driving by in their cars, which weren't very many, but when a car would pass by, they'd honk their horn. And they weren't honking at us, they were honking in acknowledgement of the monument.
Interesting.
And you see them everywhere. They're all over the place.
I'm going to say, what's the biggest surprise? I would think there would be several on a trip like this.
Well, we had a great surprise when we were near Karakoram in running across a large flock of migratory cranes, which was a big treat for me because I like birds. I mean, there probably was 1,000 cranes in this field, and they're all flying around and honking and making a bunch of noise, and they circled around me very nicely for some pictures, which I appreciated. That was a great surprise. I think we were surprised by just how wide open and sparsely populated the country was. It's hard to prepare for knowing how empty a place will feel because of the lack of human habitation, and that surprised us probably the most.
I don't know how you planned the trip. Did you mostly use the recommendations of the touring company that you went with, or did you spend a lot of time with tour books, or how did that... Do they have a general route that they do, or how does that work?
There are probably, I'd say, 6 destinations within Mongolia that are the most popular places for tourists to visit. And there's lots of information on the internet and in tour books, like a Lonely Planet book or a Brat Guide or something like that, that'll tell you a little bit about what's on offer in each of those places. So we did a lot of reading about those general areas and talked, of course, to our friend who had been there before us and talked to the tour company as well. But primarily we studied up on it and chose what we thought was going to be best for us. And then we actually had a last-minute change in plans because of weather. We had originally planned to go to the mountains in the western part of Mongolia. There's a tribe of people there who are originally from Kazakhstan who have domesticated golden eagles that they use for hunting.
Oh, interesting.
And
wow.
You can go up in the mountains at certain times of the year and visit these eagle hunters and see them and see their eagles and things like that. They even have an eagle festival, I think, in early September, or maybe it's in October, I don't remember. And we had planned to do that, but then about a week before we left to go on the trip, our tour company called us and told us that because the weather had been unseasonably warm in Mongolia this year, that the eagle people were still far up in the mountains and were unreachable by vehicle, and so we would not be able to see them if we went to that part of the country. So we made a last-minute change and went to Lake Hufskull instead, which I think I'm glad we did.
If you had a chance to do the itinerary different, would you change what you ended up doing, or would you recommend somebody to do the same itinerary that you did?
With the amount of time we had, I would not do anything differently. I think we hit the stuff that was most interesting to us, and unless somebody has a specific interest in a specific thing, I like the itinerary we did, and I think it's a good exposure to a wide variety of the different cultural things, the different scenery, and the different wildlife that is around in Mongolia.
And we haven't really talked about many of the cultural things yet, some of the time you spent in the cities, for instance.
Well, they have some excellent museums in the capital city. They have a national history museum that traces the entire history of the country from prehistoric times through the time of the Khans, and then through the period when Mongolia was occupied by China, then during the Communist Revolution in 1920, and its period of affiliation with the Soviet Union up to the current democratic days. Then there's also a museum of natural history that is focused on the different kinds of animal and bird life, as well as having an extensive section on dinosaurs, because Mongolia is actually one of the prime places to dig up dinosaur fossils in the world. And there have been massive numbers of dinosaur fossils unearthed there, including one of the most famous fossils ever discovered, which is a velociraptor and a protoceratops that were unearthed in the middle of fighting one another. So the protoceratops's jaws are clamped around one of the arms of the velociraptor, and the velociraptor's claws are in the rib cage of the protoceratops, and they were unearthed that way, and they're on display just as they were found in the Natural History Museum in Ulaanbaatar. In addition, from a cultural standpoint, there are Buddhist monasteries and temples all over the place. It's a predominantly Buddhist country and has been for a long time. And there's a great ensemble of national performers that perform several times a week in the capital that features traditional Mongolian music and dance. And that's a great thing that I would recommend to anybody who visits, because it really provides a great window into their culture.
Excellent. Now, there's one other thing that you mentioned which is not in Mongolia, which you did on this trip, and you did do a side trip to China, which we're not generally going to cover just for lack of time. But you did mention, in addition to your other trips here with, let's see, we've done mountain gorillas and we've done whales, you got a chance to play with pandas.
Right. Well, we were going through China anyway to get to Mongolia, because generally you have to fly through Beijing to then get into Mongolia. And we figured since we were passing through China, we might visit a few parts of it. And our primary destination in China was the Sichuan province. There's a city called Chengdu there, which is a decent-sized city of about 13 million people. And then there's an area off to the west called Wulong. And there are panda research centers in both Chengdu and Wulong, and we visited both of them. Both of them have captive populations of roughly 60 to 80 pandas each, of all ages, from 1 week old to 25 years old, and they breed them there in captivity to try to propagate the species. The unique thing about those panda centers, however, is that they offer tourists the opportunity to actually touch and play with panda bear cubs. And particularly at Wulong, which is kind of far away, you have to take a 5 or 6 hour drive to get there over a road that's kind of difficult to navigate. But once you get there, there are almost no tourists there, but there's this whole center full of pandas, and you pay a reasonably high amount of money, and then they let you in an enclosure with 6 or 7 panda bear cubs that are 8 to 12 months old, and you get to play with them and wrestle with them and pick them up and put them on your lap and interact with them in that way. And that was an experience that we really wanted to have and couldn't do anywhere else in the world. So we thought, since we're passing through China, we might as well have a try at it.
Excellent. Is there anything else we should cover as long as we're starting to wrap up this interview about Mongolia?
Well, another couple of things that are probably items of interest. One is that most of the tourists we ran into in Mongolia were Americans, which surprised me.
Oh, interesting.
But I think Mongolia is getting to be kind of a popular destination for Americans. Another thing is I'm expecting Mongolia to become a lot more popular next year because of the Beijing Olympics. And I think people are going to be using the fact that they're over in Beijing as an excuse to also visit Mongolia while they're there. It's certainly easy to get to. It's just a couple-hour flight from Beijing up to the capital of Mongolia. And so I think there's going to be a surge in tourism in Mongolia next summer as a result of that. And I think it's something that's going to become more popular as time goes by because it's easy to get into, not too expensive to travel in, and has a lot to offer, and particularly for people who like going off the beaten path and being away from mass numbers of other tourists. So I think it's a destination we're probably all going to hear about more in the future. And whenever I think that about a destination, I try to go there quickly before it becomes too popular.
Anything else we should say before we wrap this up?
No, I don't think so. It's a great destination. I'd heavily recommend it to people who like that sort of thing, and I'd eagerly go again without hesitation. We had a great time there, and our trip went fantastically. A lot of that was due to our guide. He did a super job, but it's just a country that has a lot to offer for an adventurous tourist.
And again, I'll put a link to Chris's pictures. Not all of your pictures. I think you said you took 14,000 pictures.
Between the two places, China and Mongolia, we shot 14,000 pictures on the trip. But of course, our keep rate on pictures is 2 to 5%. So we never do anything but with, maybe 2 to 5% of those.
So we have some hand-picked pictures, a much smaller number than 14,000, up on the website, and I'll put a link to that in the show notes. Chris, thanks so much for being on this show. You're obviously always welcome back. You always come with some interesting stories, and I really appreciate you sharing them with us.
Yeah, well, thank you again for the opportunity to be on the show. I appreciate what you do for the traveling community by producing the show and putting it out there, and I hope to continue to be able to come on for years to come.
Thanks very much.
Thanks.
I have one resource for you today. I always try and make the resources somewhat applicable with what we were talking about, and since Chris is such a good photographer, I'm choosing a resource from the Digital Photography School, an article called Travel Photography, Getting More Variety in Your Shots. And I'll put a link to that in the show notes at amateurtraveler.com. One thing I liked was the description here of the usual travel experience. You probably witnessed the tour bus photo stop before. It goes something like this. The bus pulls up at a scenic lookout. 40 tourists pile out of the bus. They proceed to rush to the fence, separating them from the castle/ruin/coastline/authentic indigenous village. They all line up in a line and proceed to snap 10 shots each as quickly as possible. Digital cameras are passed around the group so everyone can get a shot of themselves on their own cameras standing in front of the castle/ruin/coastline/authentic indigenous village. The tour guide blows a whistle, shouts out that the time is up, and gets the driver to honk his horn. 40 tourists pile back in the bus. And so this is basically an article on how to not get the same shots as everyone else when you're in the same place. Check that out. I think you'll enjoy it. And speaking of travel photography, I heard from Andrew Darlow, who was a guest earlier on the show, episode 88, Travel Photography Tips, and he is sending me a copy of his new book, 301 Inkjet Tips and Techniques, an essential printing resource for photographers. He is also going to send me 3 free copies of the book to send off to 3 of you, and the way we'll do that is I will announce the first winner on November 17th, and to enter you need to do one of 2 things. You either need to go to the discussion boards and post a post, and make sure that when you register for the discussion boards you have your email address there. That's how I will contact people. Or you need to join the mailing list. Either one will get you in the drawing for that book, and I'll probably award the other 2 books in the following weeks after that. So go to amateurtraveler.com. I hope you enjoy the new look of the site, which I've spent a fair amount of time working on, so check that out if you haven't seen it. And here's a trivia question for you. How many banners are there for the amateurtraveler.com? I'll give you a hint. It changes every 15 minutes to one picked at random. continuing with the theme of people we've talked to before, I chatted with Sasha from episode 69, Ecuador and Peru. She has since moved to Buenos Aires, and she's having interesting adventures down there, to say the least. And I'll put a link in the show notes to her new journal that is documenting her life in Buenos Aires. So I think you might be interested in hearing what's going on with Sasha. And with that, I think we've run out of time for this episode. So if you would like to contact me, remember you can always send me an email at host@amateurtraveler.com or call the comment line at 408-8494-POD. And as always, thanks so much for listening.
I got to see one more cathedral. I got to sit in one more cafe. I know that I should be heading home, but maybe not today.
The best and the brightest served up daily by the sharpest minds in content delivery, pod show, and limelight.